What was your oh shoot my life is over my parents are gonna kill me moment you had as a child/teen? First time ever getting drunk. 14 years old. Had a bottle of rum and 4 Mike Hard lemonades all mixed into a big jug. Came home that night. My mom just looked at me and knew. She didn't get mad. She just said, okay Corey, let's go to bed. It's alright. Let's go. I went to bed. The next day she made me go to school on that ridiculous hangover. That was my punishment. But she always said to me later in life, what's the point in me yelling at you? You were drunk. There's absolutely nothing that I can do. For a month I kept taking the internet cord from my parents' room and running it to the living room, plugging it in the TV box. I was washing the dishes when my dad started reading out the pronoun titles on the bill. Bro, I got you beat. My 14-year-old ass came skipping into the computer room happy as a clam one night to see my father staring at the erotic sex story I had written about my religion teacher. Yeah. I basically yipped in fear and went white, and he looked around at me and promptly lost his freaking shoot laughing. I ran away to my room as fast as I could and hid in my bed until the next day. I was terrified that he was gonna tell my mom and super embarrassed. That was 10 years ago and has never mentioned it again. Every single day my mom told me to be careful near the frozen pond next to our house. One day enough snow melted in order for my friends and I to play soccer in the field next to the pond. As you can guess, at one point the ball ended up dead center in the middle of the pond on the ice. My child brain figured if I could throw a stick on the ice, it was safe to walk on. So after making sure the ice was stable by throwing not 1 but 2 sticks, I started my walk to get the ball. It was like a scene from a movie. I reached the center and the second I picked up the ball and attempted to turn around, I fell straight through the ice and went under. I had to break the ice the entire way back to shore and had my clothes dried at a friend's house a few blocks away. By the time I got there I thought I was on my deathbed, but I could never tell my mom I was dumb enough to go out there, or she would have probably killed me. I'm now 26 and have still never told my parents I did that lol. This story takes place in the mid-90s. I was 16. Skipping school out freaking around in my car with friends. Took a turn too fast and put the car in a ditch. We got the car out of the ditch with the help of a passerby. Not a scratch on it by some freaking miracle. Get home and dad asks, so how was school? In a way that told me he knew full well I wasn't at school. If there is one thing my father instilled in me, it is this: no matter how bad you frick up, lying about it will only make it worse. Own up, take your punishment and don't do it again. So I told him exactly what happened. He couldn't really take the car away. Ed purchased it from him for full trade-in value out of money he'd saved from working at a pizza joint. But he found other ways to make my life a living hell for a few months after that. Come to find out, the good Samaritan who helped us out of the ditch was a co-worker of my dad who recognized the car and had called dad to let him know about my adventures. I was 17. Drove my girlfriend home from school. We ended up in the shower together. Just as we turned off the water and she was stepping out, we hear her dad open the front door of the house. Of course my truck is in the driveway, so he knows him there, but him nowhere else in the house obviously. My short life flashed before my eyes. He came stomping down the hallway and banged on the bathroom door. My girlfriend, wrapped in a towel, answered the door and lied her ass off. Spanks is down the street at one of our friend's house. I told him I'd call when I was out of the shower. Meanwhile, I'm standing frozen and shriveled in the shower behind the curtain preparing to meet the hereafter. Married that girl. Been together 26 years. Edit. Obligatory gold thanks. Lol. This blew up. I also replied to a few questions below, including how I got out of the predicament. Also, my wife is a preacher's kid. Her dad was one of my 2 pastors growing up. When I was 12, we were visiting my mom's family for Christmas and staying at my aunt's house like we usually did. Behind her house was a creek that ran through most of the neighborhood. This particular year, it had been really cold and there was snow at least 6 deep in most places. I was playing out in the snow and looked back at the creek and saw some really weird icicles that I wanted to get a closer look at. I crossed a fallen log to get to the opposite side of the creek, facing the back of my aunt's house, and walked along the bank looking at the ice. Basically the creek was flowing and not frozen, but there was a shelf that had frozen above it, and the ice hanging from it had formed into teardrop shapes instead of the typical spikes I was used to seeing. As I walked, I neglected to see a patch of ice on the bank in front of me and stepped on it with my full weight. I slipped and slid fully into the creek, which was way deeper than I had anticipated. I was wearing a winter coat, jeans, and insulated boots, all of which became incredibly heavy when they got wet. I was up to my armpits, trying desperately to stay afloat in freezing cold water and heavy clothes. My only thought was, my mom is going to be so pissed. Obviously I survived that incident. I pulled myself out, stumbled up the bank to a building that I thought was a YMCA and turned out to actually be a fire station. They called my mom. She came to get me. No harm, no foul, and I was not in any trouble. Although my entire family still mocks me and asks if I'd like to go for a swim every Christmas. When I was 6, I spilled grape juice on the tan carpet in the living room. I put a pillow over it, laid on the pillow, and vowed that I would stay there the rest of my life, so my parents would never find out. I lasted about 45 minutes. My mom was more upset that I got grape juice on the pillow rather than the carpet. When I came home to tell them that my girlfriend was pregnant for Thanksgiving of my freshman year of college. Getting pulled over by 3 police cars for doing 70 in a 45. My dad happened to call as I was talking with the officers. They asked to speak with him. After a few minimum they handed the phone back and said, "You better go home. That is going to be worse than the ticket we are giving you." That was a whole lot of yelling at home. When I was about 8, my sister 10, and I used to play around the neighborhood with other kids, but we had to be home by 8 PM or when the street lights came on, whichever came first. We had a watch on, and every evening my mum would make sure that we had one with us, and it was working. One evening we were 20 minutes late, and it was the second time that week. If we were late twice in a week, we weren't allowed to go out the rest of the week. My sister and I were talking by the back garden gate, making up excuses why we were late, and making sure we were both on the same page in case she questioned us. We opened the gate to go inside, and my mum was standing on the other side of the gate, arms folded. That was a life flashed before my eyes moment. So we live in a two-story colonial. My parents are away on vacation. I'm in the yard and tossing a baseball up in the air and catching it. Just a 9-year-old entertaining myself. I think to myself, hey, let's loft it onto the first split level roof, and then it'll roll off, and I'll catch it. Second toss, crash, shatter sister's window. Grandma was babysitting. Grandma reported I was smoked. I skipped school by leaving the house, climbing on the garage, and waiting for my mum to leave. I jumped down to let myself in as she drove off, and set myself up for a day on my PS1. She then came back as she'd forgotten something, and I wanted to die in a hole. The yelling was something to behold. Didn't do that again. That reminds me of my friend. He decided he wanted to skip school. However, his mom stayed home all day. He and our other friend decided to hide under the porch of another friend of ours. They played cards under that porch the entire school day because everyone on the street knew everyone. Personally, that sounds boring, and I'm glad I went to school. Was driving home early in the morning after a night of playing games at a friend's. I was going too fast on an icy road, lost control of my car, and ended up 40 yards into an icy, flooded field. Car filled with water. I was 16 and had gotten my license just a couple months earlier. Parents were actually pretty cool about it. The car recovered, but always had a smell after that. There was a small lizard trapped in our garage under a pile of wood, so I moved some of them so it could get out. I must have accidentally knocked over a larger plank in the process that landed on my dad's car and went straight through the windshield. Lizard was fine though. One time I snuck out of the house, and when I went to sneak back in, the door was locked. We never locked the doors to the house, so I knew we'd been caught. Lived on a farm, so I just went up to the hay loft to sleep the rest of the night. My sister locked me out of the house. She was still inside. So I went around banging on all the doors, and she's ignoring me. I started pounding on her bedroom window, and my hand accidentally goes through the window. Over 10 years later, and I still have a tiny scar on my hand. My mom left 14-year-old me and my 8-year-old brother alone at home to run an errand. I don't remember what he did, but he royally pissed me off, and I had a bad temper as a teenager. So, I chucked a cordless phone at his face. He started bleeding everywhere, and we both panicked. I had knocked out one of his teeth. So he ran to the bathroom to see which one, bullying the whole time. As it turns out, it was his extra tooth. He was scheduled to have it pulled a few days later. So then, the angry tears turned to grateful tears at avoiding a trip to the dentist. We did still have to call my mom, though, so that she knew why he was suddenly missing bonus tooth. He confirmed that he was glad I knocked it out, and she went up. I have to think about this. I was grounded. Edit. This is now one of those stories that we tell because we think it's hilarious. My parents had us each 6/7 years apart, so growing up we had a lot of dumb fights. The younger ones still do. It's this particular brother's birthday today, so he's at my house, and he was proud that this was my response to this particular question. His exact thoughts about the story were after I realized it was the extra tooth. It was freaking amazing. 17 years old, had a party while the parents were out of town. I had to work the next day, but timed it so I would have plenty of time to clean before they got home that evening. Came home from work, the sprinklers are on and their car is in the driveway. Driving down my driveway I was anxiety and fear personified. I walk in the house and my mom tells me, "Your dad had to leave before you got here, otherwise he was afraid of what he might do to you." In our single digits, my older brother locked me out of the house while parents were out. I threw a stick at the back door and shattered the storm door glass. Knew I was gonna get a licking, but my bro got the licking instead for locking me out. He was a real jerk to me as a kid, and we are in our 50s now, but he still brings up how guilty he feels for it. That kinda makes up for how much I despised him back then. Parents were away for the weekend. I took my dad's keys and took it for a small drive. I was never allowed to drive unsupervised, didn't have a license or anything. Was a thrill. I came back, parked, left the keys in the same drawer he left them in. Monday arrives, I come back from school and my dad asks me to come look at the car with a death glare. I had forgot to pull the seat back after adjusting them for my 14-year-old legs. I thought it was a good idea to play with some candles while having a Relotia marathon. Turns out that was a bad idea because I ended up getting distracted and set the family couch on fire. I frantically put it out and threw a blanket over it. I didn't leave that couch for a week. Did you at least look at the blazing inferno and shout Gonda calls for aid? My parents paid for my mobile phone subscription, got a girlfriend, and called a lot more. Too much more. Raked up a €600 bill. My soul left my body that day. My sister and I in 2010 had just gotten unlimited texting for $25 a month. I was 15 and didn't pay for it. Between us we sent and received almost 30,000 texts that month, which without the plan would have charged us $0. 15 a text. End of month, the bill comes round and the cell company never applied the unlimited texting, so we received a $4,500 plus bill. They fixed it quickly, but I never thought I was going to die that much before. I snuck out and took the car when I was 16, before I had a license to drive at night. I hit a pothole and blew a tire. I rode around on a shredded tire for 2 to 3 minutes before I drove up on a guy smoking a cigarette in his driveway. He helped me change it. The next morning my parents woke up early and were going to take the car somewhere, and the spare was still on. Luckily this was right when the Goodyear or Firestone tires were all blowing out, and I told my parents that it happened earlier in the day before, and I just didn't have a chance to tell them. Getting drunk at the age of 14 at a house party. My mum met me a few minutes walk away. She could hear my ridiculously drunk self the entire walk. I got drunk for the first time at 14. It was on a farm. The farm had pigs. Drunk kids wanna try to ride pigs right. Go to climb the fence to get to the pigs and I fall backwards and break my collarbone. tried to ride it out, but I had to call my dad at 2 AM to come and take me to the hospital. BC there were no adults there. I was scared to death, but my dad didn't even notice I was drunk. Phew. I was 10 years old, only pretending to drive a car with my friend in the back seat. I knew not to touch the ignition or the gearbox, so the car is parked on an incline. I lowered the handbrake and the car starts to roll backwards, moving steadily and with increasing momentum towards a concrete wall. Thankfully I knew which one the brake was, so I pressed down on it with all my might and told my friend to get out of the car and call my dad. All the while pressing down on that brake, I thought, yep, today I either die or my dad kills me. I live to tell the tale. I was sitting in my back garden with my best friend, and we'd recently acquired an air rifle. So obviously we started shooting it at things in an increasingly destructive manner. Because we were 11, we shook up and banged out a can of Coke and then laughed as it went nuts, spraying its contents everywhere. Then we got a can of deodorant, and it was even more ridiculous because it basically went bang, but in a relatively harmless way. Then we got a can of shoe polish. Turns out shoe polish is a little bit flammable, a little bit more flammable than you might expect. The explosion set fire to my stepdad's shed. The can itself went straight up like a surface-to-air missile. Armed police arrived shortly afterwards. At the time I lived in reasonably central London, and this was in 1991, which just happened to be slap bang in the middle of the biggest ever spate of IRA terrorist attacks on the city, and a couple of months after some IRA members had driven a motorboat up the Thames and fired mortar shells at the actual freaking Houses of Parliament. The bollocking we got from the police was extreme. But it was nothing compared to the look in my mother's eyes the whole time it was going on, because my friend and I knew that it was when the police left that things were going to get very bad indeed. The sense of apprehension, even worse than a riot cop carrying a rifle screaming in our faces about how stupid we were. It was horrifying. We were doomed. And so it came to pass. She went absolutely freaking mental. My mother is a mild-mannered person, but not that day, not that day. It still terrifies me to think of it almost 30 years later. Edit, as pointed out, it was a modified van, rather than a boat, that the mortar shells were fired from. Cheers all.